I'm Shawneequa Callier, Associate Professor at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I'm also a member of the NetEthics Ethics and Public Policy Panel, EP3. I have no relevant disclosures. I'm delighted to introduce the next session on project analysis and recommendations, advancing network ethics. In this session, two principal investigators from the NetEthics Project, Professors Susan Wolf and Gillian Roehrig from the University of Minnesota, will present key project findings and recommendations. These include an analysis of the current state of network ethics and the project's findings on perceived issues among those conducting research in a multi-institutional network. The goal of this session is to begin sharing some of the work of the project to get your input and suggestions. Each of our presenters will speak about 20 minutes, followed by discussion and your questions. Please remember to post your questions in the Zoom Q&A, and don't forget that you can upvote questions using the thumbs up icon. Our first speaker is Professor Susan Wolf, Principal Investigator on the NetEthics Project. She is Regents Professor, McKnight Presidential Professor of Law, Medicine, and Public Policy, Faegre Drinker Professor of Law, and Professor of Medicine at the University of Minnesota. She also chairs the university's Consortium on Law and Values in Health, Environment, and the Life Sciences. Professor Wolf is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a fellow of the Hastings Center. She is a member of the National Academy Strategic Council for Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust, and served on the National Academy's committee planning the 2023 workshop entitled On Leading a Lab, Strengthening Scientific Leadership and Responsible Research. She has no relevant disclosures. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wolf.
Thank you, Professor Callier. I'm delighted to kick off the session and join with my colleague Jill Roehrig in beginning to share with you some of the work we've done in the NetEthics Project, and really looking forward to your comments and your questions. So let me share my slides. Just to acknowledge our funding, which we're very grateful for from NSF, and also the funding for ATP Bio that helps bring us to you today in this Zoom. So the NetEthics Project, the whole goal of this project has been to surface the issues that arise at this meso-intermediate level of the organized research network, and to begin to make progress in understanding them and developing tools to enable research networks to grab a hold of them and research leaders to avert disaster and advance responsible conduct of research. So let me spend a minute on what do we mean by network in this project? Because this word network is actually used in a number of different ways. People talk about mapping my social network, who have I co-authored with around the country? We are talking about something different. We're talking about organized research networks pursuing an overarching scientific goal. And Professor Fiore talked about this earlier in his presentation. The individual component teams may have subordinate goals, but what organizes this research network is there is an overarching set of scientific goals. In addition, we're talking about dispersed networks. I mean, you could have big team science all under one roof, but that's not what we're really talking about. We're talking about networks that are under many roofs at many research institutions. Engineering research centers are an example of that, as you're going to see in a second. And often with collaborations that aren't just, silo by silo, lab by lab, but that cross across these labs and across these institutions. And the reason that we're talking about this is that this kind of complex, formal research organization is increasingly common. I pulled on the bottom of the slide a quote from the first of the two big National Academies reports on the science of team science, because I thought it captured this really well, that as science is trying to answer these bigger and bigger questions, increasingly what you see is these networks. You see people participating from different locations, different institutions, and even different countries. So we've got to talk about this problem. How do we ensure ethical and trustworthy research coming out of these very complicated organizations? So this is just a picture to show you one example. I like to sometimes think visually myself. And this example is our example from the ATP Bio Engineering Research Center. So you see that it's spread across the United States. It involves 6 different research institutions. Those are the big circles. And then at each of these institutions, you see the little circles, all the little labs. But you don't need to get into the nuances of the color coding. But what the color coding is telling you is that there are collaborations across these labs and across these institutions. So this qualifies as the kind of network we're talking about. There are overarching scientific goals. It crosses 6 different research institutions. There are multiple labs. There are multiple cross-cutting collaborative teams. And actually, there are also multiple disciplines involved. In our ERC, 2 of the big disciplines are engineering in its various types, but also medicine and surgery. So what is motivating this work, as you've already heard, is this gap that we really found. When we looked at multiple literatures, we looked at the team science literature, we looked at the research ethics literature, we also actually looked at the organizational theory literature from the world of business. And what we found was a gap at the meso level. A ton of work, as Professor Masucci talked about, at the micro level. We all know this work, the obligations of individual researchers and small groups, labs, to conduct ethical and responsible research. We also know there's a whole separate body of work on kind of macro ethics. Anticipatory governance is one methodology and approach you often hear about. Responsible risk and innovation. When we think about the large societal implications, the disruptive potential, who will this technology really affect and how? The macro issues. But what we found is largely missing this intermediate level. So this is what we fondly call our Saturn figure, that the gold area in the center really is the microethics, the individual researcher, the lab that researcher is in, maybe attention to their specific institution. The red big ring, the societal implications. But what we were worried about was this network level. And you see we've got some areas within that blue network level as we thought about our own ERC. So NetEthics as a project, you see the 5 principal investigators at the top, is organized into 3 studies. And I put a blue arrow because I'm really just going to focus in my kickoff 20 minutes on study 1. And then I'm going to leave to my colleague, Professor Roehrig, in her time talking about studies 2 and 3. So to give you the big picture, though, study 1 is basically deductive. It's convening our spectacular Ethics and Public Policy Panel, EP3, of consultant experts, working with them to identify the key issues that arise at this meso level and what values can be useful in guiding research ethics at that level. In the resources for this meeting, you see one of them is this first bullet, our preprint The article itself is in revision with the journal, filling the network gap in research ethics, calling out this problem with another article in preparation. And then study two, which Jill is going to talk about, is more inductive, where we used mixed methods to find out how did our network participants see ethical and RCR issues? Where did they see the gaps? And study three, which Jill will also talk about, then developing educational case studies that other networks can use as a tool to surface these issues and advance work on ethics at the network level. And this just gives you a glimpse of our terrific ethics and public policy panel. Most of them are participating here today, and you'll see their longer bios in the bio section of the webpage. So we are definitely building on past work, and those are the two covers. You've seen them before in Professor Masucci's presentation from the two big National Academies reports on big team science. The one on the right just came out. It's 2025, so it just came out a few weeks ago. What we saw looking at the work on big team science is that often it's focused on what you're seeing here. What are the conditions for the effectiveness and success of the big team in achieving its goals? What about the psychology of collaboration, conflict, needed competencies? We saw much less on the role of ethics in big team science and complex networks. We were aware, though, that ethical issues arise all the time at the network level. Maybe a distant collaborator who's not co-located with a team they're collaborating with becomes worried about the quality and even the integrity of the data coming out of that other lab. We've already heard from the first panel about the potential for conflicting approaches to authorship, to data sharing before publication. Labs can vary even in how they conceptualize ethics. Do they think it's even really relevant to their work beyond a pretty kind of basic level? And a network may or may not build a culture and climate prioritizing ethical analysis and conduct. This is another way of visualizing this missing meso level where we're worried about all of those issues erupting. So in our study one paper with the preprint posted that's under review, we really try to explicate what is the gap? What are we seeing both in the literature on big team science and, frankly, the gap in the literature on research ethics, which also has really not dug in on these issues. And we talk about the need for complex networks to recognize this level of challenge, to identify what values should guide the network itself in addressing those issues, not just the constituent labs and constituent researchers. And the question of how do you really equip research leaders to build a culture to support the ethical and responsible conduct of research in this collaborative process. So as we thought about this gap, we identified three different types of issues that can arise all at this meso level. Now I'm digging in at the meso level. The first is when research leaders recognize they really do have significant differences across labs, maybe across individual researchers, in how they're thinking about and approaching ethically sensitive issues like authorship credit, like data sharing. Some degree of divergence may be fine. You can't expect that these are all cookie cutter. The question is, when is it a problem for the network itself? When do you have actual seeds of conflict? You may even have eruption of conflict where somebody from one lab says, I thought I was on that paper. By the norms of authorship in our lab, I would be, but it's coming out of this other lab, I'm not. You can have actual conflicts arise. Level two is what we think of as the pure meso level, issues facing the network itself in how it organizes, how it functions, what are its capacities, issues that can only be handled at the network leadership level. And then three, does the network have the capacity to address those macro issues? This is not trying to say how those should be resolved. That's for the macro level. But has the network even thought about building the personnel, the capacity, the feedback loops to address those issues? So let me dig in for a second on each of those three levels. At this first level, which is the network worrying about, oh my gosh, have we really got too much divergence? The seeds of conflict, real conflict erupting because of the challenges of collaboration across divergent approaches in different labs. We began to think about what values were relevant. Now, let me pause for a second, particularly because of that earlier question that we got, that great question about principles. We spent time thinking about, are we talking about principles? Are we talking about virtues? There are lots of different approaches to what are the building blocks of ethics. And we ultimately embraced values broadly defined as what we were talking about, a sort of capacious understanding that doesn't require choosing among virtues, principles, etc. So the values we're talking about here to guide this collaboration are a commitment, first of all, to promoting ethics in RCR across all the labs and research groups, that kind of lighthouse that's guiding everybody. A commitment to fostering respectful collaboration. I mean, are you just ignoring the quality of collaboration as a network, or are you centering this as something that really is a core value? A commitment to advancing respect for differences, all sorts of differences, disciplinary differences, the capacity for cross-disciplinary work, a commitment to fair and effective dispute resolution. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of values we've been talking about at this first level in the meso layer. And we've been thinking about what processes can be helpful, formulating a network policy in some instances about what is the range of acceptable approaches, checking for problematic divergence from that acceptable range. And Jill will talk more about some of the tools that we've evolved in this space. What about at this second pure meso layer? Issues that really can only be resolved at the network level by network leaders. Here we found ourselves thinking functionally about network mission. Is there a commitment to ethical research and translation? Meaning, a lot of these networks, ERCs are a prime example, are not just about getting the science to work. They're about moving that science translationally out into the world, often commercialization. So thinking about the commitment to ethical and trustworthy research across that entire arc. Do you have the right people? I mean, are you of a commitment to respectful inclusion and to maintaining the needed personnel so that the challenges of ethical and responsible research are under continual analysis and hopefully progress? What kind of structures do you have? The needed leadership? Do you have an ethics capacity? What kind of infrastructure do you need? For example, do you need a unified data repository across the whole network? Or can you just rely on what each institution has built? That's really a challenging question. What about your processes and policies, the training, the mentorship, the management of conflicts of interest, dispute resolution, and of course, culture and climate? We're going to hear about that throughout the day. And again, we were thinking about what processes can be helpful here. And what about this third level? Ensuring that you've got the capacity to think about and feedback into your scientific work. What are the risks out there in the world? How do we ensure what we think about in ERCs as net societal benefit? So here, commitment to doing that, first of all, anticipating and addressing those macro issues, commitment to ensuring you've got the capacity to do it, including the resources to do it, to respectfully engaging the stakeholders you need to understand and anticipate and build into your early design and research processes safeguards against bad things happening in the implementation of your science and its application, and striving to achieve net societal benefit. Is there a commitment to that across the full arc? And again, we thought about the processes that could be useful. So, next steps. I think a goal of this whole day is to inspire people to think about this meso gap in research ethics in their own work and also in their own domain, to inspire people working on the science of team science, people working on research ethics, people working on research integrity and RCR, to look for this gap and begin to fill it. Supporting empirical research. We need to find out more about what are the challenges emerging in real live research networks. What solutions are effective? As we begin to develop tools and send them out into the world, okay, what's working? What's not working? We need to test those tools to support progress. There are really encouraging signs. First of all, the fact that you're all here today and that we are working on these issues and that NSF has really seen fit to fund this work, that there is exciting work going on at the national academies that Professor Masucci referred to and that I've been involved in, and so has Professor Fiore and Professor Swami and a number of people with us here today. That's really an encouraging sign that there's the beginnings of action to think about these complex challenges to ensure trustworthy science, even when done at an enormous scale and with great complexity. So with that, I'd like to thank NSF and all who've been involved in this work. And I will stop sharing and turn things back to Professor Callier.
Thank you, Professor Wolf. We will take questions after our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Gillian Roehrig. She is also a PI on the NetEthics project. Dr. Roehrig is Professor of Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. She is past president of the Association for Science Teacher Education, past president of the National Association of Research in Science Education, and has received numerous grants to study science and STEM education. Her research interests include K-12 STEM integration, culturally relevant STEM approaches for American Indian youth, and teacher professional learning. Dr. Roehrig is a principal investigator, as I mentioned, for this project, and she has no relevant disclosures. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So Susan set me up very nicely for this. So what I will talk about is primarily study 2, and then I'll mention briefly study 3, which is some educational case studies that we've been developing. So as Susan explained with study 2, we're really looking at, she shared some of the theory and the expertise and knowledge base that many of you bring to this setting. As you probably noticed from Dr. Callier's introduction, I do not. I'm here more as a researcher. So I'm looking at what are people in these spaces, the participants in these research centers actually saying, right? And looking at it from that level and looking to see how they're thinking about these issues. So this is work done with the NetEthics team. So myself, Susan, Professor Eugen, Dr. Pruitt, etc. All right, so I'm going to talk about two studies in this space. The first was an interview study that we did to elicit and bubble up these ideas about network ethics and RCR issues from the scientists and engineers in the center that we're working with. And as you can see, that work has been published. So it's open access. You can also grab and get more details from there, as well as what I share with you in the next few moments. Study 2B, we're still in preparation, but that is a survey tool. It's one of that suite of tools that we're hoping can be useful for networks to sort of assess where are things at in terms of network ethics in our setting, and hopefully help leaders then to navigate that difficult space and the tensions that arrive in this highly collaborative research kind of space. All right, so for study 2A, what we were looking at is how do members of large multi-institutional and multidisciplinary engineering research centers think about ethics at the network level. And to do this, we solicited from the entire ERC membership. At the time, it was 120 PIs, staff, and trainees, so that's postdocs and graduate students. And 26 of them graciously agreed to complete 30-minute Zoom interviews with us. And so what we did is we did inductive coding of those 26 transcripts, 2 independent coders working on that, coming to consensus. And what we generated out of that was 5 different themes. And I'm going to share those with you briefly so you can get an idea as to what kinds of things we were finding. And so those themes are around data sharing, authorship or invention credits, ethics and regulation, collaboration, and then finally network leadership norms and policy. So let's talk a little bit about data sharing. So many of our interviewees talked about data sharing as not being problematic. This was in a space where these collaborations had been ongoing for some time and trust was established. And that idea of trust and friendship really came out of these comments. So you can see here in the quotes I've got, participant 15 is talking about, well, we have trust with our collaborators, right? And that it's not a public forum if they're comfortable sharing unpublished data. Participant 24, yeah, if we're very close, they're like friends with us, we'll share everything we think is reasonable. So once those partnerships are established and that trust is there, not too many concerns about data sharing. But as we start to see these new partnerships come in, and this is a big goal, right, of these large networks, is to bring new researchers into collaboration, we start to see how some of these issues might sort of bubble up and cause potential problems for the center. And so you see a couple of participants here who are a little concerned. Okay, we have to think about how we share data. And you can see there at the end of the quote, participant 24 says, well, everything should be confidential before we publish or file a patent. So they have concerns about sharing within these new spaces. Participant 15 says, well, another lab, they might be able to use the statements and the data and go public, right? So there's this concern, right? If I share too early, bad things might happen. They're not saying bad things did happen. They're just concerned about the potential of that happening. And then kind of on the other side of this, we see participant 2 who says, well, we share very openly in the lab, but they're recognizing differences. So some of the labs at institution A and institution B, well, they're a little bit more secretive. So already kind of flagging that, well, they think about this data sharing space a little bit differently than I do. And participant 1 goes that extra step to say, well, if the people are not willing to share data, I don't want to work with someone like that for too long, right? So these different data sharing norms and practices, this need to build trust is a potential problem, right, as these large networks move forward. Okay, let's switch to authorship and inventorship. And what we saw there is primarily related to authorship of like journal publications. There's this really broad range of norms with how different research groups think about it. And you see the range here. So we pretty much do the work first. After the paper's ready, then the advisors will discuss authorship. Participant 15 on the other side is saying, well, we decide up front who's going to collaborate, what's going to be their contribution, and then what's the author list. So that after the fact, up front, and often all things in between, right? Participant 20 is like, well, my policy is everyone's name goes on the paper. So we're not claiming right or wrong, just there is a range of different views that can create tensions as you work with a new group who has a different norm. As we start to think about this really cross disciplinary, really complex research that these kinds of centers have put in together, some of the interviewers are starting to say, well, this makes it even more complicated. Even at the end of a project, it's really difficult to assign first authorship because a lot of these advancements require significant input from multiple disciplines. So they're flagging that this is going to become even more complicated as things move forward, and that there will be problems that are going to need to be resolved. One of the strategies we heard a lot from our participants was because we're multidisciplinary, we have this possibility to target different publications. So if I have a medical group and an engineering group working together, we could publish in a medical journal and an engineering journal, right? Those kinds of things, right? And so thinking about, well, what's the major focus of the paper, right? And if it's going to the clinical journal, then I'm going to be the lead author with the more engineering basic work, right, that doesn't have as much clinical translation, right? Then you'll be the co-author. So that separation by discipline and what the focus is of those journals is a possible way to sort of mediate some of these issues. The other tension that we heard from our interviewees was this, well, what kind of publication is it going to be? Are we going for a quick dissemination, like a quick communication paper, or are we waiting till we've got all of the data in this really rigorous, like we're going for a top journal publication? And you see that tension here with the two quotes that I've shared. This participant 16 is flagging, well, there's different ideas of what a publishable result is. So there's a tension, right? We've got some people want to say we've got our result, we get it out there for publication, but it's going to be a low impact paper versus if we sit on it for a year, really build it up, source it out, then we're going to have a really solid paper to take to a good journal. Whereas participant 1 is saying, you know, science is sometimes too driven by impact factor. I just want to get the results disseminated and get things out there. So again, that tension in publication strategy, if you will, can be problematic as we move things forward. When we move the conversation to inventorship, so what it takes to get a patent, the tensions become even bigger. And they didn't really bubble out too much from the interviews. Participant 2 kind of really flags that for us, like there's going to be issues, right? This was fairly early on in the formation of the center, right? And saying, right, as this comes up, right, this is going to become a problem. And really flagging here, this is a legal responsibility not to include someone's name who didn't contribute, right? It's not just what are the norms in my lab, but there's actual rules that can have implications for patents. So something that to really keep an eye on there is while some of the issues are similar, that notion of IP patents really sort of ups the ante on these kinds of concerns. Participants also talked about the different role and the different way they see ethics and regulation as being kind of siloed is how we heard people talking about it. Because of the clinical and biological sort of social impacts of this, we heard a lot of the more technical side, the engineers and the material scientists saying, well, you know, my eyes are on the technical design. I'm the instrument guy. I'm the material science guy, right? It's the biology people have got to worry about that stuff, right? So the siloing of ethics was something that we noticed that could be potentially problematic as things move forward. As we talked about, some of the participants talked about regulation, right? As these devices, these technologies start to go into humans, right, then there's the ethical concerns and the regulations become a bigger thing to be concerned about, right? And participant 2 is flagging that, right? The FDA rules are going to become an issue as we move into that work with humans. But different kind of ideas there. So participant 2 is absolutely not saying we don't care about the FDA guidelines, but saying let's not have that get in the way of creativity, right? We need to think outside the box. Maybe we're going to need to sort of move the regulations along with the science. Whereas participant 5 is like, oh, there's these regulations. That's like a barrier and a box, right? If I don't want to work outside of that box. So that becomes an interesting space there that our participants were starting to think through a little bit. We also heard a lot from folks about really what we need to know more about ethics, right? You know, I didn't think much about ethics until the work of the center. Now I'm thinking there might be some unintended consequences to the work that we do. Participant 5 is like, well, I don't see any immediate problems, but well, I'm not an expert. And we love the quote from participant 11, right? We're literally 5-year-olds. We know absolutely not, we absolutely do not understand the importance of it, right? So starting to understand there is a need for us to engage more in this ethical space, right? Collaboratively as a center, not just in what happens in my lab, but we've really got to think about this more. I'm not going to say too much about collaboration. We've heard a lot from previous presenters on that. But really a lot from participants about this needing to get to know each other, right? And it takes time to build that productive relationship. And at this point, as we're collecting this interview data, I just want to stress this again. A lot of these partnerships were just starting. So some of these tensions and concerns are that newness, right? I'm getting to know who my new collaborators and my new partners are. Things that came up around leadership, right? And what do we need in terms of center-wide policies? Some participants talking about participant 15 here is talking about, right, we really need to have a common understanding of data sharing, like what should the time frame be? Should it be similar for all labs? We don't need some labs sharing up front and others holding off. Like there's a need to have a center-wide policy on this space. Authorship came up there. See, participant 16 is like, oh my gosh, I don't want another requirement, but I really feel like we have to have a conversation about why are these people authors? Like, what's the research plan? Who's contributed what? So that possible need for center-wide policy on authorship. And then a need for center-wide policy and commitment to ethics. And this participant is simply noticing, like, well, I don't see a lot of participation. I know we're all busy. We don't have time. It's not really a priority. Right, but that we really need to have more of an effort in terms of the ethics pillar of the center, right? So again, that need to learn more. All right, I'm going to switch gears here to the survey tool here. And so the idea of the survey tool is to be able to assess possible issues that exist related to research ethics across the network, right? So to flag for leaders, what's going on? Are there places where we need to like focus our attention, right? So to mitigate some of the things that might be bubbling up. And so we developed that from the literature that Susan's talked a little bit about, some of those kinds of things you've heard from other presenters, and then also from what we were finding with these interviews. The interviews elicit all of these rich ideas. They start to bubble up these issues, but that's not a viable way for centers to go about this work. So a survey is a quicker tool to collect that. So we're interested in, can the survey collect that tool and then be used by leaders of these kinds of networks, right, to guide their work related to ethics. So again, we piloted it in with our ERC partner with all the IRB approvals. That you can see kind of a breakdown there of the survey. We've got questions around research lab norms, collaboration with other research groups in the network, preferences and concerns about collaboration, and then issues around network norms and leadership. And so we had 158 folks in the center that we sent the survey out to. We got 32 complete and 3 partial responses. So that's a 22% response rate, which is pretty good for these kinds of social surveys. What we were pleased about is we saw a range of responses across different disciplines, different ranks of PIs all the way through graduate students, postdocs, etc., across the different institutions. So we know that we've got a set of responses that are not all from PIs or all from a certain space. And what we're really looking for is to see, can this survey reveal issues of convergence or divergence that might need attention? Could it reveal places where there's a lack of attention to issues? And could it reveal concerns about a network policy or process that leaders might want to know about and be able to address? So again, what can this reveal that can help our center leaders think about how they might want to adapt and develop new spaces for conversation around ethics? So I'm just going to share some to illustrate. We're not going to share the whole data set here. But so just as an example here, this is one of the items that asked about what best describes data sharing practices between labs before publication. And you can see that range of, well, we share data summaries and findings versus all data is shared freely. So we have this difference that could potentially cause problems. And I'll just share one. We also had open-ended items on the survey for participants to share. Someone who shared, I worry that the siloing of data or resistance to sharing of data, especially the biology data, maybe lead into subpar or intellectually incomplete final results. So some people are flagging, if we can't get the sharing right, it's going to impact the quality of our science, right? So this divergence is leading to a potential issue. We have other items where we're specifically trying to get at this comfort level of discussing ideas early, being comfortable sharing data. And I'm going to flag, because I don't want to take too much time here, the last two there, whether people are saying they're concerned that if they share data with collaborators before publication, it might impact future ability to publish. And you can see that we've got more than 20% of people saying, yeah, we're concerned about this, right? So something, we've got others saying that they disagree with that statement, they're not concerned. But again, that divergence as these groups start to work together could cause problems. And then I'll just flag there on the last item there, which is now about seeking intellectual property protection, so filing for patents, those kinds of things. That number of people who have concerns radically increases. We now have almost 50% of our members who are concerned there. So as we move towards that space, really something that we may want to keep an eye on. So here we're just flagging an item where we simply asked participants if they felt knowledgeable about ethics and RCR that were relevant to their work within the research lab. We're not saying any bad things are going on here, but it's interesting that we've got 8 people who are not sure or say, no, I don't know if I don't feel knowledgeable, right? So just something we might want to attend to then, right? If I'm a leader of a center, oh, if I've got people who aren't sure, maybe this is something we should talk about, right? And flag as a conversation we may need to have as a center. Look at these ones. This set is to just illustrate how the survey might reveal a need to reassess policies. And so these are some questions we asked about policies in the center and whether the center has an accessible and effective approach to addressing and resolving conflicts, whether they have confidence in the ability to resolve conflict, and do they feel that they can raise concerns? So if they have a concern, do they feel comfortable and able to raise those concerns? And it's nice to see a lot of people, right, agreeing, right? But when we've got even a few people who are disagreeing, like, is that something we need to attend to? The top one there, you see more of a range of responses there. And one of the things that came out of this and looking at some of the open-ended comments is, yes, there is an approach, right? There are policies around this, but there may be a need to do more onboarding of new members, right? Like as someone comes on, right, like making sure that we have these conversations year after year, if you will, because some people are like, yeah, I know that we have this policy, we have this process, but as new members come on, that may need to be re-highlighted. So sometimes it can just reveal a simple change in process that leaders can take to sort of resolve some of these tensions. It's not a need necessarily for a new policy, but just making sure people remember that it's there and they're familiar with it. So I'll just do some quick conclusions here, and then I've got one slide on study 3. So the idea again of the survey is that it can assess net ethics issues at multiple points in the lifetime of a research center. It can help leaders to anticipate and prevent ethics issues from arising and respond more effectively to cross-network problems. The data we used, right, to look at this is from one point in the center's lifetime, but in the future, we'd be excited to look at, if we were to look at this survey over time, right, how do these ethical issues morph and change over the lifetime of these large centers as they grow and develop as well? So we think the tool has some potential for that kind of longitudinal analysis and some things we're excited to move forward in the future. And then I'm going to end with just briefly with study 3. And with study 3, what we were looking at to do here is to say, okay, well, there's this need to learn more about ethics in the center. Center members are talking about that, and what can we do to help with that? And so what we've done is we've developed and piloted some educational case studies related to these ideas around network ethics. And the ones we've developed are on data sharing, authorship, attention to ethics, and collaboration. We've piloted these with our members in small groups, done them online. They're about 1 hour Zoom conversations we have. We share a short case study ahead of time, and then have that discussion with folks online. We've tried different combinations, like would it be different if it's all graduate students or if it's a mix of PI and graduate students? We haven't been able to pilot out all of the ways we'd like to do that, but we're feeling that we have some solid educational case studies to share. We are going to be presenting those next year at the American Society of Engineering Education Conference, and they are currently posted on the NetEthics webpage. So if you're interested in taking a look at those, that's where you will find them. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to, if I can get my mouse to cooperate, stop sharing the screen. And
Thank you.
Susan and I are happy to converse. So over to you, Dr. Callier.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roehrig. We'll now take questions from the audience. Please ask questions in the Q&A using a thumbs up. I'll start with some of the questions that have already been asked. Here's a question for both Professor Wolf or either Professor Roehrig. Are there current teams or projects that are actively clarifying the boundaries between community engagement, co-production, participatory research, and citizen science, especially in relation to team science and interdisciplinary work? How are they practicing reflexivity, particularly in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and addressing blind spots, that was a term used earlier, or unknown unknowns as part of mapping careers and lives?
Well, I'll start. It's a great question because we've really been talking so far about research spanning multiple research institutions, even though we've talked a little bit about stakeholder engagement, early and deep. But there are other research models. There are complex research networks that are community-led, that are community-based. There are even virtual networks where, for example, individuals who may all be coping with a particular disease or particular condition collaborate through the miracle of the internet and really conduct research. They may partner with a research institution. All that is to say that the questioner is absolutely right that networks come in all of these different configurations with major implications for the issues that arise within the network. You know, if you have, we've seen litigated cases, as you know, Professor Callier, where a community is working with a research institution and then feels or concludes their trust has been violated, you know, that the ground rules have been broken. And so, and the questioner asks specifically about Indigenous communities, where there has been a tremendous amount of work led by Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities to really formulate the ground rules. Things like data sovereignty, data control, data ownership in those contexts. So I do think that this is a whole domain where careful attention to network ethics really is ripe for deep work.
Dr. Roehrig, would you like to add anything?
I don't know that I have anything to add there. That was certainly not something that came up from our ERC. So let's get to some other questions.
All right, thanks. We have an additional question from Elise Zhang for Professor Wolf. She is part of a team that is doing similar research on the incorporation of ethics in STEM research, adding math and medicine on the end. Our findings indicate, she writes, that the interpersonal trust and relationships between different disciplines really played a part. Where do relationship and trust situate in the meso level? Are there any findings relevant to that?
First of all, I'm thrilled to learn about other work going on, and I hope you'll email us and anyone out there who's doing related work. Part of the function of today is to connect us all so we can be in dialogue. I think Jill, in her the results, some of what we found inductively was a tremendous amount of attention to reliance on, worry about trust, one of the things that I thought was fascinating, and Jill may want to comment on this, is sometimes we saw people in now we're just studying one network here. I'll talk more broadly in a second, using words like we like them, we trust them in a way that worried us because it seemed, was it warranted trust? Was it trust based on a shared understanding of what's required to do research ethically and with integrity? Or was it more, I like them, they seem on the same wavelength, that kind of thing, a kind of more personal expression. I think the literature on collaboration is full of really rigorous attention to these issues of how do you build trust? How do you build warranted trust? How do you build collaboration? And I think of work, for example, by Michelle Bennett and her collaborators. So that's where I would look for a further development of the role of interpersonal trust and relationships. But Jill, you may really want to comment on this.
Yeah, I was thinking one of the participants talked about family, right? Use that analogy, right? Of that group, right? There was a lot of conversation as well about wanting to get to know who the researchers were in more of a social space. So there was some conversation about because the center started with the COVID start, kind of like loose sort of post-COVID start of well, meeting people online versus in person, right? And getting to know them as a human being was something that was really important. So it came up over and over and over and over again. So just I
May I
think Susan covered it.
And
Yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
add one thing, if I could, for a second, Professor Callier, which is I think the core issue of can we work together? I mean, do I actually have confidence that in co-authoring this paper or collaborating on this project, that my colleagues across the country or across the world are are operating ethically, and that we can, that we're not going to have this blow up in our face with research misconduct or a warranted paper retraction or some disaster like that. Those are real issues in the workings and the success of a network. And so I commend the questioner for bringing those forward. They are the sine qua non of successful collaboration.
You two talked a lot about the researcher's role also when you were answering the question. So do you think that this is something the meso level is sufficient to answer and address on its own, or that there has to be some collaboration with researchers? Is this a micro meso level question about trust?
Well, I think of it, I mean, within a lab, these issues can certainly break out, but I do think it's an intrinsically meso question because if you've got these dispersed researchers and you're asking them to forge new collaborations across groups, across disciplines, across institutions, is it going to work? How are you going to build the substrate to support that? How are you going to, as research leaders, leaders of a network, kind of keep your finger on the pulse? How is this going? I mean, are we succeeding? In fact, as Jill knows, one of our case studies in that set of 4 that we developed in study 3 is exactly on this issue, a breakdown in collaboration across labs that then begins to erode trust, collaboration, even willingness to talk across the whole network. So, I think we would argue that attention to these issues is vital. I mean, research leaders may see a micro issue like this erupt on their desk because somebody feels that their results were used without attribution and permission, or that they were wrongly left off the authorship list, or that somebody was wrongly included in the authorship list. So I think you're right, Professor Callier, it can erupt at multiple scales, but ultimately it can endanger the work and reputation of the whole network.
Mhm.
Thank you for that. I'll move on to another question that was asked in the chat, and it has to do with data use agreements. What do you two see as the role and limitations of data use agreements in addressing some of the data sharing ethical issues you discussed?
So the center does have a data sharing agreement. Susan and I were part of that team, right? It was one of the first things the center had to do. So those things do exist, but people have different understandings of that document and they still have their different lab norms, right? So it's not biblical, right? It's not right. People are still going to work around it. So they it serves a role. It's a place to center and start a conversation, right? But it doesn't necessarily shift people's concerns about the actual act of data sharing, right? Or does it really protect me if I data share?
So Professor Fiore and maybe Professor Masucci too, and maybe Dr. Swami all talked about the role of agreements, of documents. So data use agreements, which are an important species, are only a species of this giant genus of written agreements. And people also talk about collaboration agreements,
Mm.
the utility of those early. It's a really good question when we look at these networks. How many of these networks are using and what kind of agreements are they really using? And the ultimate question, are they working? How are they functioning? Professor Callier, you and I are lawyer bioethicists. So we, I think, bring a healthy skepticism to, oh, it's written down, everything's fine. No, uh, that may be a really important step in coming to a meeting of the minds, an agreement, if people really understand what's in it. But then it's stress tested by real life, by the realities of the collaboration. And you have changes in personnel, and you have junior people coming in, and what are you talking about? What agreement? How does that work? So they've got to be really living documents. It's interesting in ERCs because what Jill was referring to is the ERC program has been around quite a long time with enormous success, under the NSF umbrella. And there are best practices documents. There are a set of, the first 90 days and then later agreements required. But part of what we are questioning is how well are those agreements functioning to build this ethics RCR substrate? Those are really new questions. And what's missing in this agreement landscape?
Thank you for that. I see a question in the chat that may be relevant, so I might jump to that question before getting to Mayla's question. But we only have about 3 minutes. Let's see what we can do. An anonymous attendee said, I'm working in a situation now where our community engagement specialist is being private about community engaged efforts. This person is responsible for developing relationships for a few centers. While I understand protecting built relationships, the gatekeeper approach is affecting the team dynamics and potentially limiting opportunity. How do you see this in terms of our ethics conversation? So we're talking about data sharing and protecting data, and now here's a very interesting question about protecting our relationships, gatekeeping about relationships. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that?
Well, first of all, I can't, give ethics advice through Q&A, but I'm grateful for your bringing forward a real situation. And I think what it dramatically shows is there's got to be, first of all, a normalization of the idea that ethics and research integrity questions are going to come up. It is not a sign of failure that we expect them, and we're going to build a pathway for those issues to be surfaced all the way up to leadership. Some ethical issues can be resolved at lower levels. They can be resolved within the lab, or this PI can talk to that PI or whatever. But the situation you're talking about sounds like a much more profound one that is affecting the network as a whole. So in that situation, just from what you've shared, it seems that bringing this up, elevating this to the network level, both for resolution of the issue, but also for learning. So what are we learning about our network, and maybe more work we need to do beyond even just resolving this one issue? Jill, did you want to comment?
It sounds to me, and I'm interpreting the question maybe, but the community engagement piece is expanding the idea of network beyond like the different research groups, right? So I said it could be industry partners, K-12 partners, I so that even further complicates, right, the issue here as we expand the network from who are these academic institutions working together to now, right, how it's going sort of on that meso macro boundary maybe a little bit here, which I think just makes things way more complicated.
All right, we're at 12:29. May I ask one more quick question? I was interested, Dr. Roehrig, in where your survey data might go next, or where you might go next with your research questions. And I'm going to combine this with Mayla's question just to make sure I get to it,
Mm-hmm.
Mayla. She was asking about the response rates in the
Right.
survey, and if you could reflect on representativeness. And we'll end with your answer, and then I'll thank everyone.
Absolutely. I would say so 22% doesn't sound great. In the world of social science research, it's really not that bad, right? We've all received those emails that say, please take a survey, and we delete them or ignore them, right? So, and to be very, very fair to our engineering research center, they get asked to do a lot of surveys and different things. So survey fatigue, it can be real in these spaces. We're also concerned when we're asking survey questions that are about, well, are you happy with how the network leadership are doing X, Y, and Z, or those kinds of things? I want to remain anonymous, right? So checking for all of the kinds of representation might be off-putting to someone to be like, well, I don't know if I can fill it out because I'm the only African American female engineer, and now you all know who I am, right? And that level of trust, right? That they're not going, their identity isn't going to be revealed. So we purposefully kept the survey to some demographic markers that we felt people would still be comfortable with, which allows us to say, okay, we've got a mix of PIs, graduate students, postdocs, those kinds of things. We did not ask for gender, race, and some other markers that would be interesting to know if we got that level of representation. So it's a tension, right, in terms of how we can go about collecting that data. So I'll just leave it. Oh, Susan, go ahead.
I just want to emphasize that we were extremely thoughtful about how to protect the identities of people participating in this completely voluntary research, IRB approved. I just wanted to make very clear that obviously when you're doing research within a network, you've got to take those steps. People have to be protected in order to participate.
All right, we're a bit over, so I want to thank you both for sharing the work of the NetEthics Project, and thanks to our audience for your great comments and questions. Don't forget to share your insights on social media. You can tag the consortium or join the conversation using the hashtag NetEthics.